In 1841, a 6-year-old indigenous Tasmanian girl by the name of Mary was adopted by the Governor of Tasmania, Sir John Franklin. At the time, she was one of the last few remaining Tasmanian natives. Yet, just 2 years later, the Franklins abandoned her. Ultimately, she left behind more traces of her life than extensive facts, but her story provides an interesting insight into the brutal encroachment of the British into Tasmania in the first half of the 19th century. Amongst the annals of early Australian history, one character stands out due to the lack of information surrounding her. Well, there are only a few tentative details of her life which are actually available to us. As such, she has become as much a semi-mythological figure onto whom we can fashion stories about the nature of the British conquest of Australia and Tasmania as an authentic individual in her own right. This is Mathinna, or as many scholars have referred to her owing to a letter she wrote, and a watercolour painting of her from 1842, the girl in the red dress. But before looking more closely at her life, we need to explore the historical circumstances of her native Tasmania in the first half of the 19th century. Despite its relatively small size, the island of Tasmania has an outsized place within the history of colonial Australia. It was first uncovered by Europeans in the mid-17th century by a Dutch explorer, Abel Tasman, from whom the island has received its modern name. But at the time it was quickly christened as Van Diemen's Land by Tasman, in honour of Anthony van Diemen, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies Company, under whose authority Tasman had undertaken his voyage. Tasmania would be known as Van Diemen's Land until 1856, when it was renamed Tasmania in honour of Tasman, and to give it a slightly less sinister sounding name in the English-speaking world. Thus, for the period with which we are concerned, it might more accurately be referred to as Van Diemen's Land. Despite Tasman's discovery of the island, Van Diemen's Land was far too remote from the other Dutch colonies in the East Indies for it to be practical to establish a colony there at the time. Accordingly, no European settlement took place in the 17th century, and Australia in general was largely forgotten about by the European powers until Captain James Cook rediscovered the continent in 1770. In the years that followed, several French and British explorers then made contact with Tasmania, including Cook himself in 1777. However, it was not until the very end of the 18th century that it was fully determined that Tasmania was in fact an island by circumnavigating it. Once this was realised, settlement by the Europeans began in earnest. From 1803, the British were settling Van Diemen's Land. In particular, it became the major focus of prisoner settlement after use of Australia itself as a penal colony dried up around the end of the 18th century. Accordingly, by the 1820s, at least 20,000 Europeans had settled in Van Diemen's Land, drawn by readily available land and free labour, in the shape of many convicts being sent to the island. Yet, there were people here prior to European settlement. The Aboriginal Tasmanian people, or Palawa people, essentially faced a policy of genocide under British rule in the early 19th century. They numbered a maximum of about 10,000 people at the time that the British first began settling in Van Diemen's Land. However, these numbers were drastically reduced owing to disease by the 1820s. Then, between 1825 and 1831, a vicious war, the so-called Black War, was fought between the settlers and the natives, supposedly over rights to hunt kangaroo in certain areas, but in effect as a means of eradicating the natives and taking their lands. As a result of the conflict, in which roughly 10 natives were killed for every 1 European settler, tragically, only a few hundred native Tasmanians were still alive by the early 1830s. In the aftermath of the conflict, a policy was adopted by the colonial administration of forcing the remaining 400 or so Palawa into concentration camps and shipping them off to Flinders Island, one of the Furneaux Islands off the coast of Tasmania. The conditions here must have been severe, and within a few years, just 47 were said to still be alive. Mathinna was one of these. She was born in 1835 to one of the several hundred remaining Tasmanians on Flinders Island, where they had been forced to relocate. She was originally named Mary at birth, suggesting her parents had been exposed to some Christian influences and bestowed this essentially European name on her as a result. Her parents were almost certainly among those who perished in the years that followed. These were the circumstances in which she found herself being adopted by Sir John Franklin, the Governor of Tasmania, and his wife in 1841 when Mathinna was about 6 years of age. It was then that she was given the name Mathinna by the Franklins, and she was raised alongside Sir John's own natural daughter, Eleanor. Sir John Franklin was a significant figure in early 19th century British overseas activity. Born in 1786, he served in the Napoleonic Wars before turning his attention in the aftermath to a quest to find the Northwest Passage. This passage had been sought since the 16th century by British explorers as a way of sailing north over the American continent. It was believed that a route through to the Pacific could be found somewhere in the cold waters of northern Canada. Franklin led successive voyages to this effect in 1819 and 1825. These failed to find the passage, but made successful enough inroads into exploring the Arctic seas north of Canada for Franklin to gain a position of some notoriety within Georgian society in Britain. Accordingly, in 1839, he was given the office of Governor of Tasmania, and 2 years later, he adopted Mathinna. Luckily, we do have some good substantial evidence about Mathinna's life with the Franklins. One is in the shape of a watercolour painting by Thomas Bock, an Australian-English artist and an early user of photography. Painted in 1842, a year after she was adopted by the Franklins, Bock's painting depicts Mathinna sitting in a red dress and staring out at the viewer, with close-cropped blackish-brown hair. The second piece of evidence we have for Mathinna at this time comes from a letter which she wrote at roughly the same time that the painting was produced. It is the only extant piece of correspondence available for her. In it, she significantly notes that she had learned how to read. She also states to quote, "I am a good little girl. I have pen and ink because I am a good little girl. I have got a red frock like my father. Come here to see me, my father. I have got sore feet and shoes and stockings, and I am very glad." Much of this is hardly revelatory, but evidence from the diary of Eleanor Franklin, Sir John's daughter, with whom Mathinna was under the care of the same governess, is more illuminating. Eleanor noted that Mathinna was the only native Tasmanian allowed to legally remain on the island, the small number of those who had survived the 1820s and 1830s, being theoretically confined to Flinders Island. Elsewhere, Eleanor remarked of Mathinna that it will be a long time before she becomes quite civilized. However, whatever further instilling of the virtues of civilization, which Eleanor might have believed Mathinna could acquire with the Franklins, was to never occur. Well, the Franklins were not in Tasmania for very long. Still hoping to discover the Northwest Passage north of America, Franklin relinquished his office as Governor of Tasmania in 1843 and left the island with his family, with the exception of his adopted daughter Mathinna, whom he abandoned. Franklin would eventually undertake his third Arctic voyage in 1847, during which his expedition ran into extreme difficulties, resulting in Franklin and his entire crew perishing. Mathinna was now confined to Queen's Orphan School in Hobart, This was a truly dreadful place, one in which 56 children alone died from scarlet fever in 1843, the year that Mathinna arrived there. We know little about what happened to her in the second half of the 1840s, but it is possible that she was sent back to the Aboriginal reservation on Flinders Island, and then ended up yet again in Queen's Orphan School, when the Flinders Island settlement was closed. However, we have a little more clarity concerning her last years. By mid-century, the few dozen remaining native Tasmanians had begun congregating into a community at Oyster Cove near Hobart on Tasmania itself, the Flinders Island camp having been terminated by that time, as there were so few natives left to inter there by the late 1840s. It was here to Oyster Cove that Mathinna travelled in 1851, when she was about 16 years of age. We know something about the depressing circumstances of her existence here in the early 1850s, from an account composed by one James Calder, after he made a visit to the settlement at Oyster Cove in 1855. He noted that there were 16 native Tasmanians living there, presumably constituting the bulk of the remaining Palawa people. These were living in conditions of bare survival and abject poverty, stating to quote, dispossessed of everything but mere existence. Calder was a humane figure and believed something should be done to improve their lot. Although some accounts identify Mathinna as being dead by this point, this is not the case. Calder's report identified her, though it was dispiriting. The girl whom the Franklins had adopted had now fallen victim to the two vices afflicting the settlement at Oyster Cove: alcohol and prostitution. At about 20 years of age, at that time, Mathinna was particularly susceptible to both. Just 1 month after Calder's visit in 1855, she was reported as having been found dead, having passed out when drunk in a shallow creek next to the settlement at Oyster Cove and drowned. Thus, Mathinna died at about 20 or 21 years of age, in entirely depressing circumstances. But her story did not end there. During the course of the 20th century, her story has been retold many times and in many different ways, often with a liberal interpretation of the actual historical facts surrounding her life. In 1967, a book entitled Mathinna's People by Nan Chauncey was released, and most recently, a novel entitled The Exiles by Christina Baker Klein, published in 2020, has explored Mathinna's story. Yet, what many of these works have in common is a general desire not to represent the actual specific details of Mathinna's life, but rather to use the limited facts we know about her as a basis for exploring what happened in Tasmania in the first half of the 19th century. Like Pocahontas in Virginia in America in the first half of the 17th century, a Native American woman who married a British settler, Mathinna's story has fascinated many because it presents the tale of a person caught between two worlds. In the case of Mathinna, the native Tasmanian girl who was adopted by the colonial governor. As such, her life story has been used more as a symbol of the dispossession which the natives of Tasmania experienced in the first half of the 19th century and the genocide which was inflicted upon them by the British colonial government. Today, the town of Mathinna in the northeast of Tasmania is named after her. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Mathinna. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like and a comment down below. And if you're new, why not subscribe? If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them in the comments, or you can also find links to my email and to my Instagram in the description. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life.